So I'm
So sorry. Go ahead.
no. As I say, I've been at the Vermont Law and Graduate School for more than 30 years. My area of teaching there has been particularly around what I like to call enterprise, which is this, how people come together to do stuff. And it's business side. I teach corporations and business. I've also taught intellectual property, various securities regulations aspects. I also teach, have taught a class on nonprofits there at the law school, and I've also taught a class on social enterprise, which is sort of this continuum. So I've taught a fair bit. In practice, I was in practice in actively before I became a teacher. So I was actively in practice in a couple of firms in New York City, where I was there in active practice for 13 years before going into teaching. But I've kept my hand in on that. From the service side, I've been a president of a nonprofit that runs a summer opera training school, which is a little amusing. But I've also served on the board of some more significant nonprofits with hundreds of thousands of dollars in budget, and I was both on the board and once as treasurer of a nonprofit that supported the New York State Museum system. So I've got experience on those pieces. I've also have experience on the business side. I am a chief compliance officer and general counsel of an early stage company that does, of all things, artificial intelligence assisted investment advisory services. So I'm active on that side too. So I've been through the startup economy as well. So anyway, I've got a fair bit of this going on myself. So let me march our way through here. Oops, hang on, there we go. The agenda for me, from the structured standpoint, is going to be talking about enterprise and social enterprise and defining them a bit. And then looking at why would we do a nonprofit in that circumstance. Then within the nonprofits, we'll talk a bit about the corporation structure and rules. Those are the sort of state level requirements. We'll then talk about the tax rules for nonprofits, which is the key element for many aspects of this. We'll talk about the application for status. We'll talk about reporting, and we'll also interrupt as we go forward on what does this look like in practice. Please interrupt me with your questions as we go forward. This is meant to be a dialogue. I'm a professor. I'm naturally a monologuist, but I will be very happy to do it as a dialogue. Please interrupt me and with questions and dialogue and comments as you go.
And I'm a natural interrupter, so I think we make a good pair.
Okay, we're a good pair. Okay, excellent. First of all, what is enterprise? This is my starting point, because when I ask people what I teach, I say I teach business law, I teach nonprofits. What I really think is the unifying theme is I'm teaching something about enterprise as a word I might use. The dictionary definition is a project or undertaking, typically one that is difficult or requires effort. And I might say often one that involves a number of people, a number of factors, things we need to put together. So the entrepreneur, which is a title we give to people who are good at getting enterprises going, entrepreneurs put the pieces together. They put the people together, they get the funding, they get other resources, marketing, whatever it is. Basically, the entrepreneur or a team of entrepreneurs is that central node, as it were, in pulling together all the elements that are going to be necessary to make an enterprise happen. And there are different models which we have in American law to give enterprise structure. One of the things is the business organization and nonprofit laws are there ways in which the law says if you want to have an enterprise and an activity that involves a lot of people, here are some frameworks we can put it into, which will include things like how do we govern it, who makes decisions, who's liable for what, how we're going to get financing, all of the pieces of that, which whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit, the business plan questions are frequently very similar. The goal may be a little different. The structures available may be a little different, but the overall idea of we're bringing people together. We got to figure out how we're solving the problems of bringing people together. That's what we're going to be doing. Traditionally, those models, those structures, were seen in American law as really being one of two poles. You were for-profit, which was a corporation or the partnership or now the LLC. Where your goal is, I'm going to make money. That's my goal. The rest of it's secondary. and the nonprofit, which was like none of those things. We're just here to be charitable. That's all we are. We just well inclined and doing stuff for charity, etc. What we see is that most people actually don't live in one of those two poles. Most of us are not Mother Teresa and living entirely in the nonprofit, charitable altruistic pole. Most of us aren't, Gordon Gekko from the Wall Street movie, where greed is good. No, we typically live in between. We want to do some good in the world. We want to make a decent living. We want to, we want to do a bit of both of those things. So that continuum now is sometimes called social enterprise, where folks are engaged in something that could be business, but it's not just business. It could be a charity, but it's not just charity. It's somewhere in between. So it's that social enterprise notion. Unfortunately, our legal system is to a large degree still stuck in the two poles, even though and there are some techniques we can use, which we can talk a little bit about on how to make that continuum work. But today's talk is really going to be looking at the nonprofit pole. Really, where is it that end of the spectrum of charity at all? Partly because that's what our governmental legal rules give us as in terms of a model of a framework to help us structure things. Any questions so far? Okay. So what do we pick? What do we pick in this thing? Well, as I said, some of the criteria and what we pick is going to be around goals. What are our goals? As I said, the personal selfish considerations versus the social altruistic considerations. Where are we in that continuum about that? Am I just out there to make some money? Cool. Am I out there to save the world? Cool. Am I out there in some place in the middle? What is going to be my predominant goal? Because we're going to see one of the things that we have to take into account with a classic nonprofit is what are those goals? Because the tax status in particular is to some degree dependent upon defining and then living up to those goals. And as I said, it's not necessarily incompatible. Doing well while doing good ties in with the purpose. Discussions will follow. Another big question is funding types and sources, the capital. Where are we going to get the money to do this? Who are our customers going to be? Where is the working capital that we will need going to come from? All of that kind of thing. Is it going to be investors? Classic business approach. People buy in to share in profits going forward. Is it going to be loans, where both nonprofits and for-profits can have loans? Somebody rents some money to for a while, but expects to be paid back. Will it be gifts? Are people going to say, "Hey, I want to just give you some of this"? Is it going to be grants? Is it going to be a grant from a foundation or the state or something like that? Is it going to be a contract with a for-profit business, with a nonprofit, with the government as a contracting party? For instance, the social work piece that we're hearing might be, some of that might be covered by a grant from an agency that wants to promote that. Some of it might be covered by a contract from the state saying, "Hey, state, we need to have some social work aspects done in Windsor County. How are we going to do that?" Could be with customers. It could be with investors and private money. Again, there's a whole sort of continuum of possibilities that we can see in that context. And again, we're seeing some blurring these traditional lines. The gifts sort of approach was traditionally linked to being a nonprofit, but some of the crowdfunding sites and things, Kickstarter and all of that, basically say, "Hey, I'm for profit, but give me a gift. Give me a gift. Give me some money. Help get me going because I'm a worthwhile cause, even though I am for profit." So again, what we see is that there's not necessarily always just one source that we're going to be contemplating. But those sources are going to be one of the main reasons why we're going to either end up in a nonprofit or a for-profit structure. And then the final one is, how are we going to run this thing? How is it going to be run? What's the governance structure? Who's going to be calling the shots? How is that going to go forward? Those are three of the bigger questions around all this. What are the goals of the enterprise? How are we going to fund it? And the flip side of funding is who's going to get some money out, if anybody? And then how is it going to be run, the governance structure?
Professor, yeah, maybe you'll get into this later, but how much earned income, like if you have contract or et cetera, as a nonprofit, how much of that can make up your entire funding?
It could be the entire funding if it's all the earned income is from a related source. In other words, it's a programmatic source. If I am a company that a nonprofit that does theater, and I charge admission, and that admission is all I ever get because that's how I do it. I don't get gifts or anything. That would be okay. That would be all program related income, and that would be okay to be that. There's no set formula. Although we're going to see where and how it comes is important for subdivisions within the nonprofit. So there's a public charity, private foundation distinction depends partly on what those sources are and where they come from. But provided that the money is coming from activities which are related to the purpose, are what we're set up to be. If that produces income, that's fine.
Okay. All right. Cool. Great. Thank you.
Yeah. So using a nonprofit organization for enterprise. One of the reasons that we want typically to have an organization rather than just do stuff is that whenever we're just doing stuff ourselves, then we are the organization. If we're just doing stuff and somebody gets hurt, we can be sued. If we just doing stuff and we making a little money that has to go on our personal income taxes. There's a whole set of reasons why we don't want to have necessarily just me, Oliver Goodenough, doing whatever it is I want to do. So limiting liability is a key concern there. An entity can receive money, have employees, sign contracts. It's very useful to have an entity which sort of sits at the middle of all those relationships. Also, it sometimes gives recognition and legitimacy. If I go in and say, "Hey, I want to run all the school buses in Windsor County." By the way, I'm from Windsor County, so that's why you hear about Windsor County, not that nasty Chittenden County stuff up there in front of but in Windsor County, I want to have I want to run all the school buses. They come and say, "Yeah, what's your company?" And I say, "It's me." I'll tell them, "Yeah, you can go away." There's this kind of legitimacy and recognition that can come from having. Yes, it will be the Windsor County Nonprofit School Bus Alliance Inc. That carries a certain amount of recognition as we go forward. So there are a number of reasons. Those are just three. There's a number of reasons why it's very useful to create a state recognized organization form and entity to be that, to carry forward that, to personify, as it were, that activity. There's a bunch of for-profit things. There's the corporation and the LLC. I'm happy to talk about those a little bit as we go forward, maybe by comparison points. But the classic one for this area of nonprofits is often the nonprofit corporation. The not-for-profit corporation, sometimes called the nonprofit corporation. And every state in the United States has a law that allows you to set up a corporation for nonprofit purposes, as well as the for-profit corporation, which is the classic business corporation. In Vermont, we have a very good set of laws on this. The Vermont nonprofit laws are well developed and pretty flexible. There are within that options of public benefit and private benefit corporations. That's at the state level. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Some limitations can apply in how you set this up. And the states where you are likely to exert some oversight over nonprofits. There are at least annual reports, and sometimes, and particularly for charitable nonprofits, the Attorney General's office may have jurisdiction over questions like that. The tax treatment is the big benefit that we see here, and the tax treatment comes in the form of organization is exempt itself from income tax. Well, that's okay, but if we're not going to make much profit, then we're not going to pay much tax anyway. But it's useful if it makes a little profit. It doesn't have to pay tax on that profit like a regular corporation would. But it also will frequently allow grants and deductible gifts to be made to it, which is a good thing as well. Granting is easier to a nonprofit. Deductibility of gifts is pretty specific to a nonprofit. But in order to get those benefits, there are significant limitations we're going to explore as we go forward. Purpose, organization, winding up, a bunch of things that are limited on that. And as I say in bold here, we're going to get technical for a bit, but it's important. Because these rules are moderately technical, and understanding those technicalities are I think, hopefully part of why you're here, is to get further depth on that. Any questions at this level?
Any questions?
I've got a question.
Right.
If you have two identical organizations that are making and operating in identical ways, making the same identical widgets, and one calls itself a nonprofit, the other calls it a for-profit, is the only distinction there the fact that the revenue that is being generated by that organization being plowed back into the organization and not being
That's
dispersed?
one of the key points, as you're saying, is that one of the key points in we're going to get to here in a little bit, but I'll introduce it now, is what's called the private inurement question. That in order to be a charitable 501c3, which we'll get to again in the definition in a minute, there cannot be it cannot be operated or have its purpose to benefit individuals. So that typically, yes, if it does make profit, that has to be plowed back in. If it was a for-profit, then they could just take it out. The other difference, though, is that you probably could not have a classic 501c3 that made widgets, because that would typically not be a permissible purpose. So you would have to have two sitting side by side that were both dedicated to the purpose of education or social benefit. Education is actually an interesting one, because you have for-profit schools and nonprofit schools, and those sit next to each other. And the difference between those two is who's going to do what with the money, and also what's the deductibility of support to them. There are some for-profit educational enterprises that do a really good job. There are many that sadly, you got to have a look at before you get too enthusiastic about. That's partly because the tendency there tends to be that as you point out, the extraction of money into some private pocket, rather than putting that money back into the educational enterprise. Does that cover you for the moment? I think we're going to see more of that in a little bit.
Yeah, I'll wait for the technical bit and then.
Okay, there we go.
Thank you.
All right, two layers. The first layer we're going to talk about is the corporate structure and the state law level. Because in order to set up a not-for-profit or a nonprofit corporation under most state laws, you need to file a certificate. A certificate is how we get this going. Basically, it's the action which says, "Hey, I'm setting up the Windsor County School Bus nonprofit delivery service, Inc." And that would be then set up by first getting a certificate of incorporation, which says that's what we are, and says some other key things about where you're located and what your purposes are, particularly what your purposes are, and then also bylaws, which would then say how we're going to run this from a governance standpoint, who's going to be in control. And the control layer is typically has these three potential elements. One is the officers. Katina, you raised your hand. Yes.
Yeah, all these things. This is so wonderful. I will just say I have struggled the last few months reading so much on the website about registering a corporation and all these different terms that even sometimes the Secretary of State's office uses differently than the Attorney General's office. But when you say certificate, I learned, tell me if I'm wrong, please, Professor.
Go ahead.
That you're filing, at least I was told this by a representative at the Secretary of State's office, you're filing articles of incorporation. That's what they mean by
that's
certificate.
the same term, sometimes called a charter, sometimes called the certificate,
Okay.
called the articles. All of those are slightly divergent terms for what is the same thing, which is this filing with the state that says, I am setting up a nonprofit corporation. In the course of setting up a nonprofit corporation, here are the 7 required facts that you need to know. 1, what's the name?
Right.
2, where's it going to have its registered office?
Right.
3, who's going to is it going to be a public benefit or a private benefit corporation? Right. 4, what is its purpose is going to be? 5, who's going to be the initial board? There's a set of very routine elements that go into that. You skip that to the Secretary of State. If it's all said well, they stamp it and they go, and you paid the little money. They stamp it and say, "Cool. Guess what? Poof! There's now a new legal entity out there."
Right.
It's a little bit like magic. I sometimes call it magic because it's like you do the right spell and poof, there's a legal person that wasn't there before who's now a nonprofit.
Yeah, thank you.
That help you?
I had thought filing an articles of incorporation, it was a form that you had to fill out. And I'm just saying I had to get that information from somebody from the Secretary of
They
State. It
sometimes
was not a
provide
form.
it in a form standpoint because there are these the 6, 7, 8
Yeah,
standard things which are requested, and sometimes they'll give you a little form which basically says the name is blank, the purposes are blank, but it doesn't have to be on that form. As a lawyer, in fact, I always get a little snippy about just filling in the form. You want to have it look more like a through document, all that kind of thing. But that's me being a snobby lawyer about it.
Yeah. And Shalonda's wondering, how long does a process take? And Shalonda, are you wondering about the process of getting the certificate or the process of beyond that? If you're talking about the certificate, it actually doesn't take that very long at all, as long as you have the information.
A few days once it's been filed. You have to gather the information. Then getting it drafted may take a little while, particularly on the purposes clauses, because those are the ones that are the tricky ones. What is this going to do, and is what it's going to do, does that match the requirements of the law?
And I will also just jump in and let folks know that just because you filed with a state doesn't mean you're actually a 501c3. You're just a state 501c3.
You're not even a state 501c3. You're a state not-for-profit corporation.
Yeah, not for profit. And that is very different than saying that you're a 501c3, because that is a federal designation.
Exactly. And we're going to get to that on the next slide, I hope, or the next couple of slides. So that's why I say this is the corporate structure, state law. This is the first step in the process, because until you have this set up, and setting up legal entities is almost always done by state law in the United States. There are federal corporations, there are federal nonprofit corporations. They are very rare. Amtrak is a federal corporation, I think. The U.S. Postal Service is actually a separate corporation that is a federally chartered corporation. But both of those, but these are rare things. They require acts of Congress. In order to set up a state entity, one can do it just through filing with the Secretary of State, and that's how an entity is given legal recognition. One of the things Keith pieces here is how the governance structure works. Officers run things typically day to day. Officers can get reasonable salaries. We'll come back to that again on this private inurement, private benefit question, where we don't want this to be run to be basically a for-profit business for a couple people who take all the money out and salaries instead of giving themselves dividends or whatever. But people who are engaged in nonprofit can get reasonable salaries. Well, what is a reasonable salary? What would a professional in your field get? That would be a reasonable comparison. The presidents of major universities are getting $1 million a year now. The basketball coaches at major universities are getting several $1 million a year. Is that reasonable?
And I just want to make a distinction that universities, like some universities, are nonprofit institutions.
Almost all are nonprofits. The state universities may or may not be separately incorporated. As the state university might be a division of the state, but most universities, certainly all private universities, are very likely to be set up as nonprofits. There are some for-profit universities. They're rarer than the nonprofits. Most.
Yeah, like UVM Medical Center is a nonprofit.
Okay, there we go. Although it's part of the state, but it may have its own nonprofit status. Exactly. Right. Because even things that have a lot of state sponsorship often are separately incorporated in some way, sometimes as a nonprofit, typically as a nonprofit. So officers there, they can get reasonable salaries. Reasonable salary is what would be fair in the marketplace for folks who do whatever that is being done. But that, it shouldn't be an excuse for taking all the money out. The board is central to this. The board is typically the governing body of the nonprofit corporation. Some people think the president is in charge. The president isn't in charge. The board actually is the place that's in charge. The president gets the president's power from the board. The board can grant her the right to do, the power to do stuff. And on a day-to-day basis, the president may run things, but the president or chair or executive director is serving essentially under the supervision and oversight of the board, and the board is actually the locus of the ultimate power in a corporation. But they do it at the level typically of the big picture decisions. They will then delegate the day-to-day stuff to the officers. And then one of the key questions about setting up a nonprofit at this level of sort of the structure is how many board members is going to be. Typically, often this has to have at least 3. Who are they going to be? How are they going to be elected? Are they going to elect themselves? Are they going to be elected by members? What's going to go forward? And that third layer is members. And members are not always necessary. In fact, they're typically not necessary in a nonprofit corporation of various kinds, but they can be there. And if one has a membership structure, then the question is, who do they elect? They elect all the directors, some of the directors. Do they approve certain decisions? What is going to be the rights of the members? The members is a way to have a broader set of constituencies involved in the governance of the nonprofit. But the day-to-day stuff is going to be done by the locus of oversight is going to be done by the board, and the day-to-day stuff is typically going to be done by the officers. That's the classic structure. We can vary it a bit in some ways, but that's what people are going to expect to see with a nonprofit corporation. I should mention, by the way, I've been talking about corporation here, but I'm also I should mention that sometimes people set these up as trusts. A trust is probably the second most common way of doing something like this. Particularly older nonprofits sometimes have that trust structure. These days, almost everybody goes for a nonprofit corporation, but the trust structure is still available if one wants it. At the state level, there's paid fundraiser concerns in Vermont. One of the things about this is that's a concern in Vermont and regulated is what paid fundraisers, how much they can get, that kind of thing. One can't have a nonprofit that gives 90% of its everything it raises to its paid fundraisers. There are a few nonprofits in history that have tried to do that, and they were generally frowned upon that over time because of getting money. I should mention, by the way, at that state level of oversight as well as the federal level, for instance, the National Rifle Association, the NRA, got itself into trouble in New York State at the state level for having been a bit of a piggy bank for its executive director. As one may recall, that there was a bunch of, and that's actually was a court finding, and so the Attorney General of the state of New York came after that and said no, you're the then, if I recall the facts correctly, the then executive director was buying all of his clothing through credit cards from the NRA. Well, what's that about? And so, well, you got to be well dressed to be the president of the NRA. And the answer is no. You got to be that's your responsibility to pay for your own clothing and things like that. So again, that's that kind of question. And we'll see that again at the federal level, but it's also at the state level. And most state governments require some form of annual report. This is true, I believe, in Vermont, that there's an annual report. It's not wildly difficult, but it's one of the things you got to do. Okay.
There's a question. Yeah, there's a question in the chat. Please clarify. I thought under Vermont statute that officers of a nonprofit board cannot receive salaries or compensation for their service on the board of directors.
No, the board of directors maybe not, but officers can, and in their capacity as officers. In other words, officers would be able to. I'd have to check a little further on that to see what happens with the overlap. But boards typically don't get paid. Officers typically do. I mean, if you've got an executive director of a nonprofit, that's what they're doing professionally. They need to be paid, and they need it for their own sake, and it's only fair to try and compensate people for good professional work.
So an officer would be an executive director, an associate director,
Executive director could also be could have the classic president titles, things like that. Sometimes the president is the title of somebody who's on the board. Sometimes it's the title of someone with an operational responsibility.
Why is the naming convention so scattered? Like, we are talking about the certification, and then it's also the articles and the charter, and then you have the people like presidents and then executive directors.
Part of it is just good old American resistance to centralized authority and dictation. You know, I don't know about you, but I have I have two children, both of whom told me as they're growing up, I'm a Vermonter and I can do what I want to. Anyway, that didn't fly fully with me, but I always thought it was a nice idea. You know, America is a bit like that. We allow a certain amount of flexibility in titling and that kind of thing. We also on the charter certificate and articles question, that's partly just what state law calls it. I forget which one. Vermont I think talks about articles. Other states talk about certificates. It's just whatever the law was. There we go. So one checks in, you know, if you're going to do a Vermont nonprofit corporation, one needs to make sure that one looks at the statute, and if it says that they're called articles, we call them articles. If it says we call them a certificate, we call it a certificate. It's just cookbook stuff. And you're right, it's a little confusing. The jargon is a little confusing, but it's pretty much the same thing. It just depends on the usage in the locale.
Great, thank you.
Okay. How do these things work in practice? Establishing and observing the formalities matters. One of the ways in which that limitation of liability works is if everybody actually does the right thing. We elect the directors. They elect the officers. There are meetings that occur at least annually and typically more frequently than that. There are minutes kept of the meetings so that we've got a record the meetings happen. In those meetings, we make sure that we memorialize the important actions that we're taking and approving. Bank accounts, clearly something that needs to be kept separate. The nonprofit needs to have its own bank accounts that can't be commingled with somebody else's bank accounts. That's a big no-no. Another question is ownership. Who owns the vehicle for the nonprofit? It should be the nonprofit if it's truly the nonprofits. Sometimes it's possible to lease things. That's cool, but typically that should not be leased from the officers or directors. The officers and directors should keep a clear wall between their own business and the business of the nonprofit. And then there's the necessary filings, the annual filings, the initial filings, making sure that it's all done correctly, all the boxes are reasonably checked. That's how observing the formalities matters in that way. Also, one should be aware of there are other rules that the state level that may kick in. There may be employment aspects, benefits, accommodations, workers' comp, unemployment, discrimination rules. Those many of those cover nonprofits as if they were for-profit. Sometimes there's a nonprofit exception, but just because one's a nonprofit doesn't mean that the environmental laws aren't there. Sales and other taxes may or may not apply. There are rules that govern exemptions to sales tax. Sometimes those have to be applied for separately. Sometimes there's an exemption on paying sales tax if you buy something. Sometimes there's an exemption on charging sales tax if the nonprofit is selling things. Other tax exemptions, real estate tax exemptions can be available. That is often done on a town-by-town basis in Vermont. There are a whole bunch of different rules that are there. I want to make sure people remember it's not one and done. Sadly, with the filing and I'm a nonprofit, I'm done with the government. No. It's all the other pieces may or may not click in. There are some exemptions, but they're not always. Requirements and registrations for specific industries. A child care provider, if your child care provider is a nonprofit, that child care provider is still going to be doing all of the registration that we require in Vermont for child care providers. Social work pieces, a nonprofit, it can sometimes be the vehicle through which that is done. Cool, but if that's the case, the individuals will need to have their certifications, and the nonprofit may need some certifications as well for certain professional activities. Oh, okay, so yeah, go ahead.
I have questions. I have two questions. So in terms of the formalities, who's creating the formalities? Like, do we have to use Robert's rules, or can the organization establish their own formalities to follow?
They can establish their own formalities. Robert's rules are a useful technique for managing large meetings.
Mm-hmm.
Not required, particularly if it's a board meeting of 3 members. Having Robert's rules is a little silly, so yeah. It can be less formal. Typically, however, when an action is to be taken, it is taken in the form of a resolution adopted by a majority of the members of the board.
Okay.
That formality is typically how that will happen, that there will be a resolution and it will be adopted. The way that is debated, et cetera, can be a bit loose. One does not have to do that, all of Robert's rules. But again, often it's on a motion made and seconded and duly voted on. The following resolution was adopted. Resolution might be, we hereby make a grant to the Vermont Law and Graduate School of $1,000. Okay.
So where are we able to find this? Because if you haven't, you know, encountered either Robert's rules or been in something like this before, within the state statutes, are there, is this kind of
there really isn't in the state statutes, not typically. You know, the state statutes may mention certain kinds of aspects of the board deliberation, but there won't be anything probably in detail there. What this is in some ways just learning the practice. Let me take 1 minute. The reason that we typically have a board resolution is that we craft that to be very specific about the decision being made. Because when we go back and say, what did we decide? If the minutes just say, you know, we voted on and approved hiring Oliver Goodenough as executive director. Well, what salary, you know, what was, and there's a bunch of questions. It's a little informal. That's not so bad. So we say, hey, we approved renting space from the XYZ company. Well, what was the lease, etc. More formally, if we can, typically we would say the lease from the XYZ company was presented to the board. The board discussed it, and if there are questions that are worthy of noting from the meeting minutes, you know. Wei raised the fact that the rent was too much, or that it was on the second floor and wanted it on the first floor. Oliver said, "Oh, that doesn't matter because we got stairs," or you know, whatever it is if that's worth recording, we would record that in the deliberations, and then we would say, on motion duly made and seconded, which is this notion of the Robert's Rules piece, the following resolution was adopted. The charity will rent on the space there on the terms presented in the lease as attached to these minutes. There we go. The reason for that is if there's a question in the future, you want the question about what was decided in the future, you want that to be reasonably establishable by what you put in your records. The whole purpose of the record is so that, or if a regulator comes in and says, hey, who'd you rent from? You can say, I rented from these folks. You've got that paper record of why it was that this decision was taken.
Okay.
Does that make some sense? So
yeah.
The degree of information you want there is the degree of information that will be useful for people 5 years from now who are a different board and don't know what they did, to look at that and said, we have a pretty good idea of what was said.
And what the questions were that came up, so that,
exactly.
And that's how we came up with it. And that's why, so like, if these formalities are not established, if those records aren't kept, then we could be open to lawsuits. We could be open to like,
exactly.
Could they take away our designation?
Yeah. Or if the nonprofit folks from the IRS run an audit on you, you know, are you properly set up and doing the right things? Ooh, you don't have any minutes? Well, what do you mean you don't have any minutes? Well, we just kind of got together and discussed stuff. Well, yeah, okay, cool, but we don't know what that was. We don't know why you're doing it, all that sort of thing. So this kind of record keeping is a bit of your offense and defense in terms of, you know, their legal structure and what you decided to do.
Mm-hmm. And if people, for example, if they're, for some reason, they've established a nonprofit, maybe it's still earlier, maybe it's a little further along, and they haven't been doing that, is it too late to start?
No. Start whenever you can. There's something we also can call retrospective ratification. Often, if we realize that we didn't do a proper job, then the current board can ratify the prior decisions to do X.
Mm.
So we can do after the fact ratification. Not as good as before the fact authorization, but after the fact ratification can step in and do at least some of the work you're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anything else on that? sort of the state level stuff. Okay, this is how we see this working out at that first tier of setting up the entity, making sure it's got the proper governance structure, making sure it's got the proper purposes, all that stuff. It's filed with the Secretary of State's office. It's got its own bylaws. It's got a record book, a minute book of keeping track of its deliberations. It's got its own bank account. It's got its own whatever, and we're up and going. We're ready to go.
So you have to do that before you go into the federal.
You have to at least some of that before you go to the federal, because the federal has to see your certificate of incorporation to know that because the federal say that we have to have certain things in that certificate, in those articles, or we won't grant you the status. Why? Because the purposes in particular and the processes set out in that certificate are what really govern, and they have to be consistent with the requirements of our tax law for us to give you that status. So yes, at least that portion of it has to be all set up and in fact done before you can then file for your tax exemption at the federal level. Okay. Tax exemption at the federal level. 501c. There are 2 or 3 important tax provisions that govern nonprofits, and that are in some ways really the controlling law of nonprofits. And the first one of those is Section 501 of the Federal Code, and in particular subsection C. And C has a list of many different kinds of organizations. There are more than 25 different kinds of organizations that will be exempt from federal income tax. Now, this is cool because it means you don't pay taxes on your income, but this doesn't govern who gets to deduct donations and that kind of thing. But this is the sort of question number 1 under the federal tax rules is, are you set up to be one of these 501c's? Now, we hear about 501c3. I'll focus on that in a moment, but there are other things under 501. So 501c6 is clubs. So it's business league. 501c6 is business league. We can set up a league of the League of Businesses of Color. Okay. And that would be a cool thing to have, but that would be, if it was aimed at business and helping them be good businesses, that would be a business league. So that's not a charitable purpose. Helping people be good businesses isn't a charitable purpose, but it could be a business league, and that business league could be a nonprofit and collaborative and could be not subject to income tax, but it would be under C6 typically. Clubs, if you've got a swim club that you organize, a community swim club, that could be under C7. As could other non-charitable clubs, if there was a non-charitable club of various kinds. So 501c3 is the big one, and from this standpoint, why is that the case? Because it's the charitable one. It has a charitable or social benefit purpose of some kind. And the elements of that are that it's organized, organized and operated exclusively for its tax-exempt purpose. And that has to be in its charter. It says we can't do anything. The only thing we're legally authorized to do is the stuff that is here, which is a tax-exempt purpose. It also has to say no private inurement, none of that private benefit stuff. It will be not organized or operated to be basically a piggy bank for a human. It can't be, it has to be the purpose, that tax-exempt purpose is its thing. And also then typically limits on activities, including political activities. There are certain limits on what it can do. And that purpose, the tax-exempt purpose, if it's going to be 501c3, here's the list: religious, charitable, testing for public safety, literary or educational purposes, or to foster national or international amateur sports competition, but only if no part of the activities involves the provision of athletic facilities or equipment. What you see there is the original text is through educational purposes, and then sports competition gets kind of added on this. Basically, the NCAA gets going on this, and some other sports leagues, sort of semi-charitable sports leagues get going on this. So there we go. And the prevention of cruelty to children or animals. Okay, that's the list. If one is going to have a 501c3, the purposes of that organization have to match this list. If they don't, there we go. That's why I said when it was raised, what about making widgets? I don't suspect that unless widgets are scientific or religious, we're just not going to, making widgets isn't going to be a purpose that we can have this with. Okay, it has to fit those purposes. Mixed use examples.
But what if the making of those widgets is for the benefit of the, benefits one of these inclusions?
Purposes. I would have to be shown to be direct. Direct. Now, this is in fact what I'm just going to get to in a moment. For instance, suppose we have a mixed example with farm with education programs. Probably not 501c3 if it's a farm with education programs. If it is an agricultural education organization that has a farm, that probably is okay. You see what I'm saying? What's the primary thing going on here? Are we making widgets, or are we training and educating workers? And one of the ways we do that is we've got a widget factory. Okay, does that make some sense? It's somewhat, in some ways, it's just about how we frame it, but it's really also that sort of existential question: do we exist to make widgets, or do we exist to train up widget makers?
So there are a couple questions in here. Nicole, I will go to Nicole's first as an example. She's asking, could the farmer have a for-profit LLC for the farm and a nonprofit for the educational work?
Potentially possible, but it's going to be a little tricky, because if they're really sitting right next to each other like that, is the education one just exist to really help the private group, the private farm? In other words, if you'd have to then make really pretty clear that non-family members were the directors of the 501c3, that they had an agreement with the farm about what the rates would be and how we'd do this and how we'd collaborate. Document it, make it clear that we're not running this nonprofit to help the farm. So the farm is here, the nonprofit is here. They can work together. That's cool. But the working together, not working in order to make the farm make some money.
So let's take a more local example, real example of the Alchemist, because there's the Alchemist, the brewery, but then there's also the Alchemist Foundation. And I believe that the money, some of the revenue from the brewery goes into the foundation to give out as charitable giving.
Right. But as you said, it goes out to give as charitable giving. What is the activity and purpose of the foundation? It isn't to support the brewery.
Right. They just happen to have the name.
And the funding comes across and it has the name, and that's cool. But the activities of the foundation are not to support the brewery. Mm-hmm. If instead they said, hey, yeah, we'll get some gifts and things. And by the way, we're gonna have educational beer nights. And we're going to buy up, a bunch of the beer from the. No. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. It's not a bright line in this. It's never quite typically a bright line. But I mean, we can see how close it is and how close it isn't. But the foundation should be running itself to be the foundation's purposes, which are going to be charitable, and not running itself to help the business.
So in the widget example, then, so if the purpose of the organization is to, let's use the education piece, and then over the course of running the organization, they're like, well, we have the funding source to create a widget that would serve the purpose to educate, blah, blah, blah. So in that case, would that
could be easier than just we're making widgets and selling them to somebody else. If the widget turns out to be a tool that is used in education, that would be easier, because now it is directly related to that exempt purpose of education.
Okay. Great.
Okay. If the widget just is something we put in toasters and then that there's no charitable purpose. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And there's another question here: is an employee professional association that has education as part of its mission also charitable?
An employee association is probably going to be one of the other 501Cs. Again, that was something that I don't want to give direct advice on that, but the education could conceivably, again, it's a question. What's predominating? If it is an association of a particular class of employees or whatever, it is more likely to be one of the other 501Cs. If you Google, I won't because I've got my screen up with this, but if one Googles Google's employee organization tax exempt status, I suspect something will jump up fairly immediately at what C that it ought to be.
And so maybe it could it also be charitable, but the primary goal of the Employee Professional Association is that professional association, and so that's how it identifies. Where
that would exactly. I mean, again, as I say, there's not like always an immediate bright line, but if you look at this thing and say, hey, it's an employee association, treat it like one. Sometimes they would set up a stand beside nonprofit that could be the education wing could be done directly in it, or if it was useful, could be perhaps a secondary nonprofit. Does that make some sense? That sometimes there are, as Nicole's question suggested, sometimes you can set up multiple structured organization pieces. And I'm aware of various kinds of C6s and other Cs that have an education wing or something, which is then a charity, which could then receive charitable contributions.
Okay. Does that
but
answer your question?
That education wing better be about education and not about how we improve the lot of our members.
Okay.
Because improving the lot of your members is not a charitable. It's a private inurement piece that you're helping the members.
Okay. Yeah. But if it's for the broader public, then that's
exactly. Charity is typically for the broader public. Your own members, you're getting into private inurement problems.
And so that would but
that's why clubs are C7s, because a club is there to benefit its members.
Okay. So what would like a VBSR?
Business association is a C6 because it's there to help its member business association.
So then like chambers of commerce and like VBSR.
C6 is almost always, yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. They're still part of the 501 universe, but they're C6s, not C3s.
Okay. And so then they wouldn't be eligible for certain 501c3 opportunities.
Exactly. But they would be nonprofits, and they would be not subject to federal income tax, and cool.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Now, what are those nonprofit organization opportunities that 501c3s typically can have? One of the big ones is what can be deducted by a donor. And this is one of the really big ones that most 501c3s can get, although it's actually not under 501c3. This is under section 170 of the code where this happens. And the qualifications under 170 and under 501c3 are almost identical. But they basically, so if you qualify for 501c3, you probably qualify for section 170. And 170 says that, subject to some limitations, people can deduct from take a charitable deduction for what they get. And this is in effect a kind of sponsorship, a kind of a subsidy from the federal government, because the federal government is saying, instead of paying the federal government taxes on that income, you give it to somebody else, you give it to a charity, and then you don't pay us the tax. So if the tax rate is around 30% or a third or something like that, a third of the gift is basically going to the nonprofit instead of going to the feds. Now, there's some limits on how much we can do with this, often up to 50% of income. The limits are lower for what's going to be called a private foundation rather than a public charity. There we go. We're going to get to the end of that in just a moment. Okay, but the key element here is that for a donor, the donor can take a portion or all of that donation and say that my income tax is going to be, my taxable income is going to be reduced by that amount. If I'm a rich person, if I'm making $1 million a year, and I give $200,000 to the Vermont Law and Graduate School, that $200,000 probably just comes off my taxes, and now I've got $800,000. I was able to do something with that I liked, but instead of buying a house with it or going on an around the world cruise, I gave it to the nonprofit. The feds say, cool, it's not, we won't tax it. Okay. Different benefit, but a key one. Also, key in this is sometimes grants, etc., or from government are also keyed into this status, but they are not keyed into this status because of the deductibility of the gift under 170. A little technical. We get that? 501 says is my organization itself subject to tax? 170 says when I get gifts, can that person who's the giver get a benefit? Okay. Limitation by type. And here's where a distinction comes in that's an important one to keep in mind. And this is the distinction of two flavors of charity. Public charities and private foundations. Public charities are charities who support, there's a bunch of tests that do this, but it's often public charities are charities whose support comes to a significant degree from the public. Well, what does that mean? It means either in revenues from that theater company which is charging tickets. It can be from small donations around the United Way, with all those small donations gets in this one. Money from the government is often viewed as public money because it's got governmental tests attached. Often somewhere in either between one test is minimum of 10%, but mostly it's somewhere in the neighborhood of a third. If about a third of your money comes from these good sources, maybe you're a public charity. A second way to be a public charity is just by type. One is by support, the other is by type. Educational institutions are just public charities, automatic. Okay, because we like educational institutions. There's not necessarily always a good rationale for this. The rationale can be what Congress wanted to support now. So educational get that treatment, even if they're without regard to their support. Although most educational institutions will get at least a third of their money from their tuition, which is public money in the area, and they go. But why does that matter? Well, one, the donation base differs. Right, the deductibility is a bit different. So if it's a private foundation, the amount of your income you can deduct is less than if it's a public charity. And secondly, there's a whole bunch of rules called the private foundation rules, but in sections 4940 to 4947, basically of the code. I had a list of this. Professor Caloran said, "No, don't give them a list. It's a deep enough dive as it is. Don't go there. Don't go there because there are very specific rules about who you can rent your property from. What kind of investments you can make. Let me just say that if you fall under private foundation, you've just spent a fair bit more on lawyers and accountants for the year. And there's, by the way, a middle ground, which is called the private operating foundation. The private operating foundation is a private foundation, but it spends almost all its income on operations. Many of the rules go away. Some of the deductibility goes away or improves. Private operating foundations is sort of in between the public charity and the private foundation. So if you're a private foundation, you can get justify that you're a private operating foundation. You just cut a bunch of those legal and accounting bills off because you don't have to worry about a bunch of the rules. It gets very technical. My only point here is that if you end up being a private foundation, you got to pay attention to those rules. They're picky, they're nasty, they're annoying. You got to do it. So what you really want to try and be if you're going to use your the 501c3 as a basis for your operations, you want to use it as be the best a public charity and the very least a private operating foundation for doing what you do. Okay, questions? Yes. I said technical, little deep divey. There we go. All right, so how do you get this? First of all, there's application. In order to get this status, you got to make an application to the IRS. Say, IRS, I'm a nonprofit. Here are my purposes. Here's how I'm going to operate. Here's where my funding is coming from. Here it is. It's called Form 1023. And there's a Form 1023 EZ, which is less complicated. It's not fully uncomplicated, but less complicated. The prediction is that it's going to be less than 50K a year in income or less than 250K in assets. You can sometimes qualify for the EZ form, and if that's the case, it's annoying to fill out. It's not triply annoying to fill out. There is nothing in this that is rocket science. It's just box checking and being careful about. But you got to sit down and say, what am I going to do? Where's the money going to come from? What is the operation going to look like? How many board members are we going to have? Who are those board members? What does it look like in our charter? Do we have the necessary things that say, here's our purpose, no private inurement? Oh, and I should mention another one is that if it's wrapped up if the nonprofit wraps up, all the money that's left has to go to a nonprofit. There's just these required check the box things, and if it's there, cool. If it's not, it won't qualify. So detailed and picky, especially the long form. That can take a little while. I haven't done one myself recently, but they can take, A, it takes a while to get it filled out. B, you got to wait till you exist and then, get it all in. And then C, the IRS can sit on it for 9 months. You're nodding. How long did it take yours to come through?
Well, actually, because we had a special request for expedited. So first of all, we had to go through the 1023. We couldn't do easy because we just barely made it over that threshold of like we had like $50,000 worth of funding at the time. So we had to go through the long form. And then it took quite a while because even though we had a pro bono lawyer supporting us, I ended up filling out the entire thing and I got support from Tino and some other folks. And what ended up happening because we were doing some COVID emergency work, I will say, this is a warning to everyone, that the IRS ended up calling me and I thought they were catfishing me. So I did not think it was real. In fact, it was real. And they have been trying to reach out to us since June. We ended up getting formal 501c3 in September, and we filed in March.
That's pretty quick.
It was really, really quick. It was expedited for a reason. And they kept trying to call us. So if you qualify for that specifically, it can happen quicker, but because, it was a special circumstance that we were able to get it that quickly.
I mean, back when I was doing this more actively in practice a couple decades back, it could take 18 months. It was just, now, the good news is that provided you get your status, you can retroactively, everything is okay.
Yeah.
But if you don't get the status, that blows up on you and that can be really messy. And so.
And I'm wondering, like, because of this experience, like you're talking about how difficult the form is, it is very difficult. And there were a lot of questions where I was like, I don't know what the fuck this means. Excuse my language, but I didn't know what it meant.
That's a technical term, by the way.
It is a technical term. What the fuck does this mean? So at what point do you recommend having legal support on these filings? Would it be better to have somebody?
If you can get somebody either afforded or get pro bono, that can be quite helpful because most of us are not used to filling out this kind of formal governmental interaction. It is not rocket science; it's just doing it. But if you're not used to doing it, it's still it may not be rocket science, but still I don't know how to do it. The instructions are reasonable; they're straight, but they are long and complicated, and they want to know who's on your board, what's the relationship, where's your money going to come from, what is this going to look like, what's the percentages here, what's going to be that, what's your activity, do you have anything to do with the government at all, are you the successor to someone else? Because this is often where folks get really held up, as if they're trying to take a for-profit and turn it into a non-profit. Whoa, bunch of alarms go off in the IRS because that's a private inurement problem. Are we doing this just so we can pay off the debts of the old for-profit? Isn't a good purpose. That's not a good purpose.
And I think it's important too to know, Professor, when the professor says they want to know who's on the board, they want to know everything. Like I needed to have, I think, social security numbers for people as well. So these are the things before you start the process, really understand what they're asking for. I think there's like a printable form. I will also say that sometimes if you click on one thing, it will add more questions to what you're doing. And also, I think it's really important to be aware because I've heard of some folks who have clicked the wrong button and then they get filed as something completely different than what they wanted to be. And they have to go through the entire process again.
Right, and they didn't qualify exactly, or you didn't click the button to say I'm a public charity, and then suddenly you're a private foundation. You've been granted status of public as a private foundation rather, and now suddenly you got all those rules which I didn't think applied now do apply.
Yep.
It's a pain. It's a pain. It's the modern regulatory state. What can I say? You got to love it and you got to hate it both at the same time. It's one of the big questions of the 21st century is what do we do with this thing where the mechanisms we have for keeping behavior good are often very complicated disclosure and reporting. There we go. Lawyers often are trained into this. Non-lawyers can do it. It's just a question of figuring it out and doing it. but some legal help, some knowledgeable local guide help can be helpful. If some can I use Google to figure out Google Maps to figure out where to go eat in my hometown in a town that's strange? Sure. If I talk to one of the locals, I may get a better outcome. There we go. And again, this is something that the Vermont Law and Graduate School's program can help people too. At least at the moment, we've got some funding that allows us to provide up to 10 hours of service, lawyer service on a reduced rate basis. Professor Kaloran, is that still available for nonprofits?
Yes, it definitely is. We were able to add that last year, and we'd love to talk to any nonprofits who need to work with the lawyer.
And that amount of time may be enough to cover some consultation and the filing on the initial filings, and then the consultation and some help on the 1023. It won't cover
So, yeah.
the lawyer do the 1023, but it will cover, you know, getting on the phone and saying, I know, twice during the process and saying, okay, here's my questions. Can you help me?
Yeah, 10 hours really covers a good deal of the initial paperwork. Or I want to say this for anybody who is an existing nonprofit, that 10 hours can go quite a ways towards reviewing everything that's in place to make sure that it's up to snuff.
We can't cover any litigation matters. So if the nonprofit's getting sued, we can't cover them. And don't forget state forms filings, etc. And the state tax forms, etc. I was on the board of a nonprofit once where I joined the board and the goal I was, you know, I had like one meeting, and I got a bill from the Vermont state tax people for $25,000. I know what. What's this about? It turned out that this nonprofit had hired at one point an executive director that had ended 2 or 3 years earlier. It was now done by volunteers, and that person actually had died. But the Vermont tax people presumed that we just gotten sloppy and stopped sending in our tax withholding, and made a calculation on that tax withholding based on what it would have been if that same person had been employed for the past 2 or 3 years, and send it to everybody on the board. Because if you, as a member of the board, don't pay your Vermont or federal state taxes, state or federal income taxes, make the appropriate withholdings, you are, as an officer, are liable. It's an exception to the normal liability shield. Luckily, I could write them back and said we did not have this employee. In fact, the person is dead. Nothing is owed. I could write that back in good faith, and they wrote back and said, "Oh, terribly sorry. They don't know anything." But just be aware that kind of thing is out there. If one is not doing the right forms and fees and deductions and all that stuff. Wait, you're looking a little concerned.
I mean, that's horrifying, and so that just makes me think. Y'all, if you're setting up a nonprofit, make sure you have the right tax people around you. Make sure you have things set up. Happy to offer some suggestions along those lines, and have some good legal support as well through the Vermont Small Business Law Center. I think that is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, dotting I's and crossing T's is what keeps you out of trouble. And that trouble can sneak it up on you through a variety of different avenues. And just, you know, making sure that part of the reason for this is to educate. Part of the reason is to scare a little bit and say, you know, make sure that, you know, do those formalities, make sure you're getting it all right. See here, next thing. Yes, what do we see in practice? 501c3 organizations must have that limited scope. The purposes matter. The mission must inform decisions and activities. Okay, so again, if it's a 501c3, it has to have that charitable, educational, etc. purpose. That has to be what the organization actually does, and that's the guiding light for it. Operations matter, how it does it. Watch out for that in private inurement. No buying a board member's used car. Even if it's thought to be a good thing, that's self-dealing. There we go. Make sure the pay is reasonable and appropriate rather than not. As I mentioned, converting from for-profit to nonprofit or vice versa is tricky. From for-profit to nonprofit, there's a whole set of problems about successor disclosure and rules. If you're the Form 1023 actually has a whole subsection. If you check that box, another 10 lines open up saying, "Okay, tell us about how this is happening. Tell us why the new nonprofit isn't just bailing out the old for-profit." but whatever it is arm's length with different people involved. Nonprofit to for-profit, there's the winding up restrictions. Suppose there's a nonprofit a nursery school that's going to become a for-profit nursery school successor. The for-profit, they can't get just be given all the assets of the nonprofit. It's got to pay for it. Why? Because that value needs to go back and then be distributed to other nonprofits in the daycare area rather than helping the for-profit. And again, those winding up things will be in the certificate typically. That's one of the things the IRS requires. So again, we're in this circumstance where if there's a conversion, that private inurement question is just always lurking, and it's tricky. It can be done. It's just got to be done carefully, and you know, you just hired the lawyer for another 20 hours. Okay. Which model do we pick? All right, we go all the way back around. All right, now what model do we pick? Well, it often depends on the dollars, where the dollar is going to come from. And remember, for-profits can sometimes get grants. For-profits can have a contract with the state. For-profits can have a contract with a nonprofit to deliver some of the services the nonprofit would do. Nonprofit can hire a lawyer, can hire a law firm. Okay, cool. The nonprofit is hiring a for-profit to do some of its work. Private found. I should also say, in addition to the dollars, it's also what's the purpose? What's the purpose? Is the purpose really one of those charitable things that is the predominant purpose? If so, cool. If that's only kind of a secondary purpose and maybe it would be nice to have a little education, it's not going to probably do. Remember that private foundations are harder. They have less capacity for receiving charitable gifts, and they have additional rules. Not everything can be a public charity. Again, there's tests. One can try and make it, public charity, but it's not necessarily going to be there. Take also if one is a private foundation, one needs to be careful in making grants and investments and things like that. That's part of what the rules are. So, before starting out on this road, plan carefully around the purpose. Really come to grips with this. Is our purpose going to be one of the things on the list of the 501c that we're looking at? Probably 501c3. What is our purpose? Is it going to fit? Our operation is going to fit when we get there. Gather your information. Gather the information you need. Gather information like this session. Learn. The IRS is full of guides. They tend to be a little opaque. There's a variety of organizations. Vermont Nonprofit Alliance, I believe I forget its exact name, exists to do this. National level organizations. There's Vermont state level organizations that are aimed at doing some of these things. You have friends, as you've heard Wei say. This organization can be your friend and help you on that. Fill out the 1023. Okay. Yeah. Look at the 990 early. Look at that annual report before it's due. Don't wait for the last week. In fact, actually probably want to look at the 990 while you're setting up, and just where every year I'm going to have to tell the IRS this. Therefore, let's make sure we're keeping the records that let us tell the IRS this. So that we plan our operations with the 990 in mind, then it's easy to fill out, or relatively easy to fill out. If we're just digging through shoeboxes for the information, in old receipts that we may not have saved, that's not good. Get an accountant. Get an accountant and lawyer on the team if you can. That would be great. Final considerations: legal structure for the enterprise is important. One of the things we've said, what legal wrapper are we going to put around this? Could be for-profit, could be non-profit. There's many forms to pick on from the continuum. And this may be a lecture in the future. Is what do we do if we're in that continuum? What if we're in that social benefit, social enterprise structure that isn't all the way to the non-profit? The rules governing non-profits are particularly picky. It's a benefit the government gives you. When the government gives you a benefit, they like you to know that they like to know they gave it to the right people. There's a bunch of reporting and stuff that is there. It's picky. An enterprise's goals inform where it falls on the continuum too. Those are my takeaways. Questions? Happy to chat.
Yeah, and please feel free to put any questions in the chat, or if you want to come off mute, or if you want to come off camera, however you want to do it. So my question is, where would a low profit organization fall?
Low profit organization is not a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
There's in Vermont, we have something called the L3C, the low profit not limited liability company. It's really set up for a particular rule under those private foundation rules. Remember, I mentioned that how they make grants and investments is controlled. One of the rules says I can't make a significant investment in a private company. But I can make a significant investment in a private company, either if it's a traded stock kind of thing, classic portfolio stuff, that I can make that investment as part of my endowment. But I can make a more directed investment in a larger directed investment if it is a program related investment. It's a program related investment. That's an investment that's made for a purpose that is part of a charitable purpose, and B for a that is where the intention of profit has to be secondary. The primary purpose of the investment has to be, I want this good thing to happen. Oh, and by the way, if we make some money, that's cool, but it's secondary. The L3C is set up with those baked into its rules. So it is perfect for that circumstance of a private foundation program related investment in a for-profit company, but we make some money, but it's secondary. That would be cool if it happens. But the primary thing is we're gonna educate people. We're gonna provide the following social benefit, whatever it is. That's the primary purpose. People, by the way, are using it for social enterprise kind of in between things, and it's not terrible to do that, but it's really not designed for that primarily. What it was really designed for was to be this specific thing that we could use for having for-profit enterprise linked to non-profit funding.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. and just in terms of kind of going in a different direction, for nonprofits, because you've made the distinction between, for profits, and then there's a private foundation, and then the public charity. Can private charities give out donations to
private foundations or public charity? What do you mean?
Oh, sorry, for public charities.
Yes.
With the 501c3 status.
Yes.
Because, like, for example, we've received donations from 501c3s.
Yes.
So it sounds like 501c3s can also give out grants.
Yes, absolutely. And public charities can give those grants with far fewer restrictions than private foundations. Why? Because private foundations are subject to those rules under 4940, etc. And then one of the section rules is about how you make grants and who you can make grants to. If you make grants to a public charity, that's typically not such a big deal. If you try and make a grant to another private foundation, that can be a big deal. You have to then sometimes exercise what's called expenditure responsibility. You, the private foundation making the grant, have to oversee how it's been carried out at the grantor, at the grantee level, at the receiving level. It's just, again, it's more boxes to check and more oversight to do. More complicated. So yes, both public charities and private foundations can make grants, but the rules for private foundations on making grants tend to be more strenuous, particularly if they're going to another private foundation. Private operating foundations don't have the same level as a regular private foundation, and in that context either. Remember, I said there were a bunch of different ways that being a private operating foundation could be a benefit, and these rules are one of those areas. So
then thinking about like public charities, if they're giving out a grant, they're not subject to any of those rules about who they're giving it to? They're still subject to the rules that it has to be for the purpose. Has to be consistent with the purpose, has to be consistent with a bunch of things. It's much more likely to draw scrutiny if they give the grant to a for-profit organization. But they're under much less, I won't say none, but they're under much less level of scrutiny than a private foundation. Okay. Cool. Yeah, I'm just wondering because I know with all the flooding, there are a lot of nonprofits who received funding from Vermont Community Foundation because they can't give to individuals. And so, for example, VTPOC, we're giving funding specifically for recovery from the floods. So. And those grants, again, I don't want to give direct advice, but grants that are being made by, are you a public charity? Yes, we are. Again, far fewer restrictions on that. They have to be consistent with purpose, et cetera, like that. But there wouldn't be typically the same level of
there wouldn't be typically the same level of kind of justifying each individual grant and oversight and all the things that would come happen if a private foundation were to try to make those same grants.
It would be tough. Yeah. Okay. I don't want to hog all the time. There are other people on here. Do folks have questions around nonprofits, like general questions? There's also an opportunity, and I'll be sending out an email afterwards with a follow-up on how to access the recording, etc., as well as how to reach out to the Small Business Law Center to get the more free legal education, as well as the 10 hours of free legal.
And Professor Cloran, do you want to jump in here a little bit? And I've got the screen up on the legal services piece. Do you want to describe our activities a little more fully?
Yeah, well, actually, they're pretty well described here. We can do, depending on the urgency of someone's legal need, we can do a short educational consult, usually scheduled within a week or two. We can do just like a half-hour call if somebody needs that, if they haven't heard like a quick question. We can also do scheduling a little further out, usually 5 to 6 weeks. We can do a full hour with our team to do a deep dive on research questions that anybody wants to talk about. Those are sort of the educational consults. And then just wanted to mention too, of course, if there's a group of people who have questions, we love to meet with groups of people as well. Doesn't have to be through a fancy organization like VTPOC. It could just be a couple of people who want to talk nonprofits. That's great too. That's our primary services. The one that really seems to get folks to the point where they can take action and really get themselves on firm ground is 10 hours with an attorney. So we cover 10 hours for anything that doesn't require representing the business or the business owner in court. So that covers everything from just advice to, even if somebody is in some sort of a dispute, we can support them negotiating that, for example. Just can't cover that representation piece. So yeah, we would love to talk to anybody who's looking for that support.
Yeah. Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, so are there other questions for the professor on the topics that we discussed today, format and stuff? And if not, that's okay too.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to chat a little more on any of that stuff. Perhaps go around each folk. I know that you came in with different sets of questions about professional services, perhaps, or other more specific questions. I don't mean to put you all on the spot, but I would Stephanie or Shalonda or Candace or Rod, anybody with a particular question.
There were some questions. Well, first of all, I have to apologize to everyone on here because the Eventbrite that we used, it had the last webinar on legal liabilities and insurance topics for businesses. But wondering if folks have any questions around like, oh, what kind of insurance do we need to think about? And that might not be the professor's wheelhouse necessarily, but maybe you should have general liability insurance as well for a nonprofit. Those are the things to think about. And
I'm with you, both general liability and sometimes also board and officer errors and omissions, which covers the folks who are setting it up. Those are not necessarily inexpensive. Sometimes people's individual policies will carry some liability rider for nonprofit activity. That's worth checking out. My general approach on this, because it isn't my wheelhouse, but my general approach would be find a really good insurance agent and listen to them. A good insurance agent shouldn't just be selling you policies, but should be analyzing your risk profile and helping you choose the policies that you can afford and that would be useful.
Yeah, Candace is wondering, can we revisit the board one again?
Sure.
You talk a little bit more. Yeah.
About board, just how they work?
I think maybe about the insurance.
Oh, insurance. Okay.
Oh, who can be on the board? I apologize. Who can be on the board?
Who can be on the board? Typically, people over 18, can be on board. People who are adults and have that capacity. Although I can't think of anything that statutorily says they have to be 18, but often that's not a bad criteria. But youth groups could have 16-year-olds or whatever. The key element is somebody who will be able to contribute to the mission of the nonprofit. in some way. And that contribution is typically said either time, talent, or treasure. What are the classic threes that nonprofits often say? Time, folks who can just be there and do the stuff that needs doing, because a lot of nonprofit depends upon the willing contribution by people of their time towards it. Talent, people with special talents can be useful to have a lawyer or an accountant involved. If it's a professional corporation that's going to be doing certain kinds of social services, somebody who's an expert in that, some form of expertise that would be useful. Education, folks with teaching background, etc. The third one, treasure, is just, hey, can you help us out with some money?
Yeah.
And many boards have a minimum contribution they ask of most people at any rate. Well, they almost all make exception for folks who are not people of means and who we need anyway. But typically they say, hey, back up your presence on the board by making a minimum contribution. And that can be for small community activities, that could be a couple $100. For major national organizations, that can be hundreds of thousands is the minimum. So that's often. Don't select the board for folks who will contribute in some fashion, and not just folks who are going to be either masthead, or relatives or whatever it is. Get a good working board is a board that will have that combination of necessities so that the needs of the organization are done.
But Professor, is it possible for a staff person to join the board as well as organizational members?
Yes. Normally, yes. Although that's got to be handled carefully. Sometimes the bylaws will say we have to have someone from the staff on, because that would be a good thing to do. But that person may need to recuse themselves in salary discussions. It has to be handled carefully so that not all board people can be participating in discussions about every subject. If it's a subject where there'd be some conflict of interest, some self-dealing potential, then that person should remove themselves from that. And the minute should reflect that they remove themselves from that, so that there's no appearance of impropriety. And that kind of thing just needs to be carefully handled. And
then if it's like a membership organization, members can also be on the board?
Yes, that would be typically the group you would be aiming to pull from. Sometimes the bylaws say, 3 of the 7 members have to be the board, have to be members of the organization, or whatever it is.
Okay, great. That's really helpful. Candace, I hope that answers your questions. And if you have any more, please feel free to drop them into the chat. Yeah. And when it comes to like membership organizations, you think about, I'll just use VBSR as an example because it's top of mind. They usually have like annual meetings where some decisions might be made. Is that how membership organizations have to run?
Typically, typically members will act through a meeting of some kind. Back to our Robert's Rules discussion, they don't have a meeting of some kind, run in a reasonably organized way, is how they take action. Most membership organizations have at least an annual meeting of members. That allows the election of directors and other things to go forward. It is infrequently more frequent than that. In my experience, most sort of say annual is the minimum. That's what we do. If there's a reason to have a member meeting, every quarter, and we do that too. The directors typically will meet more frequently, at least annually, but typically more frequently, maybe every quarterly, something like that. And then every some do monthly, depending on the size and the importance.
Great, that's super helpful. Does anybody else have any questions for the professor, since we still have him for about 15 minutes? Feel free to drop any broad general questions or otherwise. Professor, is there anything?
One of the things that professors do is sometimes stun their audience into silence. So I'm working on.
Well, you haven't done that yet, Professor, because I'm still talking. So right, I think you failed in that mission. No, is there anything that you have those takeaways, if people are starting nonprofits, what is like the one thing that they have to do, like from your perspective, that you've seen other people really, they kind of fucked up? So,
well, one of the things to do is to figure out what kind of nonprofit am I? Am I a nonprofit? And then how will I fit into that? Will my purposes and operations fit the requirements of 501c3? Am I trying to stretch myself into that box when it's going to work. So really, do I fit? And do I fit one of the other 501(c)s? You know, am I a business league? Am I an employee group? One of our folks here was thinking about being an employee group. By the way, an employee group would go through many of the same steps. The purposes would be a little differently. There's the requirements for that, and that would have to be what it was made. There would still be a 1023 filing. There would be a bunch of things. The deductibility under 170 probably wouldn't be there, but that deductibility isn't what's going to make the employee organization isn't necessarily going to be looking to get somebody to give them a donation of $10,000 to run. They're going to be looking at dues and other ways to get that funding. So figure out where in that universe one fits, and then design against that. And then the other piece is just be aware that there's a fair bit of picky work that needs to be done, and the willingness to do that picky work thoroughly and correctly.
Yeah. And I guess from my perspective too, it's like, okay, well, yeah, that picky work of like, do you want to be an LLC? Do you fit into the nonprofit realm? And I personally recommend, I did not know Nicole prior, like to, I think 2021. And so like, I wish I had this resource, because I think we got everything through, but I don't think it would have taken quite as long as it did for us to go through this process and to try to figure it out, because, you know, looking online, it's so hard to know what the structure is. And I know I've referred a lot of people to Nicole and the Small Business Law Center team to decide what structure makes the most sense. And they really quickly, they're very efficient in terms of like helping you make those decisions. So thank you for that service.
No, well, thank you in return for the shout out. But also, I remind you, sadly, we can't give you direct advice.
Yes.
But we can do is help educate someone about the framework, and often as a matter of the education, a bunch of decisions sort of make themselves almost automatically. Oh, okay, yeah, I want to make widgets. I'm not planning to do anything on that list. Guess what? I'm a for-profit.
Exactly. Yeah, and there are a lot of other resources. And there's a question in the chat. Any leads for getting funding as a small sole proprietor LLC who is not seeking to be a nonprofit? Stephanie, I'm happy to take that offline too. We do offer technical assistance for small business owners. So happy to offer that assistance, but I don't know, Professor, if you...
Yeah, it's not so much a legal question as it is just a sourcing question of, are there grants? Are there sources of funding? The Small Business Administration has a set of programs around lending and things. The Vermont state programs exist. There are some direct aid programs from other nonprofits, etc. Sometimes actually vendors and suppliers can be sources of funding. If one is going to be using a lot of computer equipment, maybe the computer equipment company will provide a purchase loan on that. Again, there are a number of different places to think about. The legal question might come in if that then carries some, if it is a debt, is there something to look at there? But the sources is less a legal question.
Yeah, and I think the thing to be careful with getting funding is, well, please correct me if I'm wrong, Professor and Nicole, being aware of like the tax implications of like, you might have to pay taxes on the funding that you receive as an LLC.
Yes, and it depends on how you're receiving it. If it's income, then it may end up being. I mean, if it's just a straight grant, that might count as income, and then now I have to pay income tax. If it's but that can then offset with the expenses relating to that grant. Typically in the profit and loss of the LLC for tax purposes. Getting some tax advice is almost always a good idea on almost everything.
Yeah. Yeah, and Stephanie, very happy to connect. I dropped Erin's email in there, and she is our community support coordinator. So she provides technical assistance for businesses as well as nonprofits. So if you have any questions there, she can also.
There are other Vermont agencies that can be helpful. We have a partnership with Vermont Small Business. Nicole, help me on my initials.
Small Business
Development
Center.
There we go. And they have
SBVC.
very, very useful and very knowledgeable advisor folks there that can be hooked up with. So there is, yes, Weiwei, your organization can be immediately helpful, but there are other places to
Yes,
go.
absolutely. And we usually direct folks to those other organizations once we have an understanding of what it is they need. Because sometimes it can be difficult figuring out which organization to turn to, depending on the size and the scope of the business.
Cool.
So, but yeah, this has been wonderful. I don't know, Shalonda, if you have any other questions, or Stephanie, but I will be downloading this and we'll be uploading it to YouTube, onto our YouTube channel. I don't know that it's easily findable, so I'll send a link out once it's available. And that's where you can see some other of our recordings as well on contracts, legal liabilities. And next month, we're going to have a webinar on regulatory compliance specifically for small businesses. So I think that's going to be an exciting one. And that's coming up, I think, on June 24th, sometime during the day. But I will send an email out to follow up on all of this, as well as sending out materials that the professor and Nicole have gathered together, as well as a PowerPoint and contact information. So
thanks so much to you and your organization, because you're doing wonderful work, and it's thank you for involving us and giving us a chance to chat with some people from our standpoint.
Yeah, and thank you for being here, Professor. I know that, end of the semester, you probably want to take a little bit of a break, but thank you for being here and offering to talk with us and giving us so much insight on what it is to be a nonprofit from the legal perspective. So,
okay, well, you're very, very welcome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right. Bye, everyone.